I call the honourable member Claire Curran.
Thanks, Mr Chair. I too, being the first speaker on this side of the House to speak to this bill in the committee stage, would like to acknowledge the work that the Commerce Committee Select Committee did on this bill under the chairpersonship of the Honourable Leanne Dalzell. Very well chaired, and there was some really interesting discussions and some good submissions. And as I always do, I like to acknowledge the work that the Commerce Select Committee does, as it's a very effective and functioning Select Committee. I'd also like to acknowledge the work that the member who originally brought the bill to this House did, Amy Adams, and the good work that she put into it. And you're very welcome. So what I'd like to talk about, I'd like to reference some things that were said during the second reading of the bill and talk a little bit further about them, Mr Chair, because in the second reading of the bill, I think it was Louise Upston who actually spoke first in the second reading, and she said that the purpose of the bill was to increase the transparency and public accountability of third-party businesses that collect the funds on behalf of registered charities, which was a concern that the disproportionate percentage of donated money may be retained by third-party collectors to cover costs, we reiterate that those views were very important, and ultimately this bill is about recognising the right of people to know where their hard-earned money goes when they choose to donate to charity, to the charity of their choice, or profit-making third-party collectors. And the bill, there's always there should be, Mr Chair, always an underlying principle behind any bill. Sometimes in this House I wonder whether there is, but certainly in this bill there is actually an underlying principle, which is a worthy principle, and it is that it's consistent with sound consumer rights principles like transparency and informed choice for consumers. Informed choice for consumers. And I have a lot of commitment to those things, as do the members of the party that sit on this side of the House, and consider that those things are actually pretty damn important, Mr Chair. And I too went to a function during the dinner break, and it was a function about polling and truth-telling in polling, and how polling is reported and is actually conducted. And that's also an issue which is quite dear to my heart, Mr Chair, from the background that I come, the work that I've done for the past 20-something years, and the importance of truth-telling in polling and reporting is really important, just as it is in debate, discussion and policy and legislation that's conducted in this Parliament. And I'd like to talk in relation to those principles of consumer rights and transparency and informed choice in relation to this bill. And if I don't get finished, I'm sure I'll get another chance during the debate on in the committee stage of this bill, because in the last 4 and a bit months of this year, there's been a series of debacles in this House that have come from that side of the House that are certainly not about truth-telling, aren't about consumer rights, aren't about transparency or informed choice. And when I actually wrote a list of them, I I'm sure some of my colleagues would certainly come up with a few more, but there's some very significant ones that aren't about transparency. And the point being that how can you trust a piece of legislation that's brought in the name of truth-telling, consumer rights principles, transparency and informed choice when there isn't any being demonstrated from that side of the House? Mr Chair.
I call the honourable member Claire Curran.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I'm just getting started. And I'd like to list them because here we have, and they're all to do with dirty deals, cronyism, backroom discussions that really aren't about informed choice or discussion with the public of New Zealand, and the public of New Zealand doesn't really know what's going on and it is having to cop what's being decided by that side of the House. We'll start with the Craver Farms. Then we had the asset sales and the asset sales legislation. And as part of the asset sales, we're now seeing in relation to consumer rights and principles of transparency and informed choice that lie behind this particular bill, we see there's the Sky City, which is essentially selling the law. We've got the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade debacle. And then we've got the teapot tapes, the cup of tea with John Banks.
Point of order. The honourable member Sam Lutuinga.
Mr Chair, we're talking here tonight about the Fair Trading Soliciting on behalf of Charities Amendment Bill. But this member, who's an experienced member of this House, should know better and should bring it back to the relevant legislation that we're discussing tonight, not some sordid allegations that she's dreaming up.
Thank you. First of all, can I say that I did actually indicate to the member on my left to narrow it, and she did, and then she moved out again. So just warn the member to try and talk to the debate. But I can also say to the member on my right, the points of order are terse and to the point. Thank you. I call the Honourable Claire Curran.
Thank you, Mr Chair. And I would like to reiterate that the Fair Trading Soliciting on behalf of Charities Amendment Bill has at its base principle the principle of transparency and informed choice. And the point that I am making is that transparency and informed choice, Mr Chair, in a piece of legislation, in order for that legislation to be trusted by the public of New Zealand, needs to be reflected across the behaviour of the party that's actually bringing the legislation to the House. And what we've seen in the last 4 and a bit months is certainly not transparency and the principles of transparency and informed choice and consumer rights that's been reflected in that behaviour. And so I think it's important, with reference to this legislation, the Fair Trading Soliciting on behalf of Charities Amendment Bill, that we do actually have the ability to do a comparison with some of the issues that have arisen consistently in this House. And I was also going to refer to the issues of the child poverty documentary, where you saw the Prime Minister's own electorate chair, who sits on the board of New Zealand On Air, which funded the child poverty documentary, objecting to it being shown before the election. That case actually, with relation to transparency and informed choice for the public of New Zealand, Mr Chair, and there is certainly relevance here, is actually important because it's actually been shown through a recent decision of the Broadcasting Standards Authority that there was no bias being shown in that documentary. And when you think about transparency before in a piece of legislation, charities, well, we've heard, the thing is, if you want to talk about charities, you could talk about donations, and we could get into donations to charity and the amount of donations that have been made two lots of 25,000 donations that were made to certain members of this House who have had convenient amnesia.
Order. No, can you just say I know the member was responding. Order. Both of them. Sit down, please. I know the member was responding to an interjection, and so I let her respond to that interjection. But now she needs to come back to the bill. Honourable Member Claire Curran.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. I would like to reiterate that this piece of legislation is a good piece of legislation. Labor has supported it. It certainly does do no harm. There has been a wide debate within the Select Committee. There were some very good submissions received, and there was some good submissions received from a number of charities who had some very good points to make. And as you know, and they included the Arthritis Society, which the member tonight referenced, and a number of other charities who had some very valid points to make about in good faith, Mr. Chair, about the importance of the issues that they were bringing before us. And I suppose that, when you look at the points that are being made tonight about transparency, if a piece of legislation like this is actually going to the heart of what...
I call the Honourable Member Jonathan Young.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm very pleased to stand